I'm just going to get right to it. I wrote Secrets in the Shadows, as you all know, and I would have never thought that writing a novel would be such a huge undertaking. I spent the last 10 years researching and writing this novel, but I didn't do it alone. And I think a lot of times when we embark on such a large endeavor, it's very rarely that somebody can do it all by themselves. But I won't go into mentioning every person that has encouraged, inspired me, and assisted in bringing this novel into your hands and into mine, because I've written their praise and their thanks in my acknowledgement of Secrets in the Shadows. Besides, if I mentioned everyone, that would be a book, and this book Zoom launch would become a Zoom Oscar speech, and we don't want that. But thank you everyone for being here, and thank you everyone that did help and was instrumental in getting this project done. Thanks from the bottom of my heart. I do want to thank my publisher, Ronald Hatch and Ronsdale Press, and his team, Megan Dyer, who was the assistant editor at the time, and Julie Cochran, who designed the layout of the novel. And I think she did a really nice job with that. And Nancy de Brouwer, she designed the cover of the novel, and as you all know it. And I think she did such a great job. And funny little story was, when I signed with Ronsdale, I was told that I would get 3 covers to choose from. But when this first image came in, right away, I knew it was the one that I wanted. And how I knew that was, when I saw the image, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry or throw up, because I was like, oh my God, this is real. Everyone's going to know what I've done. And the judgment on that was quite overwhelming for me. But nevertheless, I was so excited about the cover. And what was wonderful about it was that Nancy hadn't read the novel, and it was but sheer coincidence that she had chosen the Wilhelm Kaiser Memorial Church for the main picture. And I'll just show you what it looked like before it was bombed. I don't know, can you guys see that? And that was taken in 1935. So just, a few years before the war started. And then here's a picture of it in 1906. And I thought that was really interesting because it's so similar to this. It's only well, the war. So it's interesting what can happen just in, what war does. Anyways, so what happened was, why I chose the Kaiser Wilhelm church was because first in 1943 the church was bombed during a bombing raid, and the main steeple stands today in Berlin, and the Berliners refer to it as the Hollow Tooth. And I was inspired when Graham and I took a trip to Germany in 2009, and it was my first trip back to Germany since my family and I immigrated to Canada. And we were exploring Berlin, and I had no idea about the church at the time, and I had just started to think about writing this story. And so we were walking down the main street, and all of a sudden in front of us stood this blown up steeple, and instantly I was transported back to World War II. And at that moment I knew that somehow I wanted to include that church in the novel because it's such an iconic image. Also, I had the opportunity to interview Ed Krautwinkel, who was a boy soldier in the SS and trained as a paratrooper and a sniper. And when that opportunity came up, I jumped right at it. And when I interviewed Ed, he was in his 90s. I spent hours interviewing him, and what he shared with me was really quite eye-opening and pretty crucial for my research. through interviewing him, I was able to understand a deeper level and the complexity of a soldier's life, and what is lost of self in war when you're in battle. When I interviewed Ed, I mostly listened to his accounts of his service in the SS. And while we were talking, he handed me a German World War II semi-automatic assault rifle to hold. Well, I'd never held a rifle before, and that was a little bit eerie. And what kind of struck me about it was how solid it was, you know, and it was already over 75 years old, and how heavy this thing was. It weighed about 25 pounds. And what was interesting about holding that rifle, I was able to just feel a little bit of what it must have been like for a young boy of 16 with hormones raging and being with his comrades and having all that firepower, and also feeling frightened at the same time as they were all marching off to war. And to me, that really helped to flesh out Michael and Wolfie's characters, especially when they went to battle. And a lot of times I like having, you know, objects from certain time periods of what I'm writing about, because it really helps me to feel and give a more authentic voice to the characters. One of the things during writing this novel, I really realized that I love doing research, and my writing room is pretty much filled with research books. I also realized I had no idea how to read and decipher a military battle map. And just so you know what I'm talking about, this is a map. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out who was who and where everyone was moving and going. And I had no clue what all the little symbols on the map meant. But I just kept staring at it over and over for weeks on end until I was finally able to decipher it. And I have to say, that was one of my hardest challenges, to figure out where people were going and who was fighting who. But another thing that I came across, which I found interesting, well, it's kind of funny, was for the longest time I would come across the word bridgehead, and I was like really confused. And every time I came across it, I would just kind of skip over it because I didn't understand what they were really talking about. Soldiers were constantly being ordered to hold the bridgehead, and I was just like, what on earth are they holding? And for those of you wondering what that is, it's the ground around the end of a bridge, and it's crucial that a soldier either protects or blows a bridge up in order to defend, secure, take over, or hold a position. But learning about battles and who was where and when and how many moved about and what sort of rifles and ammunition, tanks, grenades, and who was in charge of who was easy compared to trying to get this novel published. The journey to get Secrets in the Shadows published took over 140 rejection letters. And after the 100th rejection letter, I started to think that maybe I wrote a really crappy book and that I'd wasted 10 years of my life. But I kept myself, surely there's one more thing that I could do. And when I discovered that SFU offered a manuscript consultation with a choice of an established author, I chose Evelyn Lau to look at my manuscript. So when we met, I was pretty nervous meeting her, and one of the reasons was I really didn't want to hear that my novel sucked, even though I was almost convinced that it did. And in bolted Evelyn, and she leaned into me and she said, I Googled your name. And I took a step back and said, okay, and I shook her hand, and she continued, I'm so glad you're a woman. And I just smiled. She continued, she said, I thought you were a 90-year-old SS soldier that was writing his World War II memoir. And at that moment, I realized maybe my manuscript doesn't suck. And Evelyn Lau's generosity and kind words really helped breathe hope and determination back into me, and not to give up the fight to get this book published. It's really easy to lose hope and to doubt yourself, and it's important to have people around you to cheer you on. I found that was just so instrumental from keeping me from getting more and more depressed. And for me, I was extremely lucky to have so many people cheering for me, as all you guys. The key person for me is Betty Keller, my mentor for the last 11 years. She was my first teacher, and I believed, and she really took me aside, and she believed in me and the story. And this novel would never be what it is today, was it not for her. And talk about cheerleaders. I had a squadron of them. You guys, my hair clients, oh my God, you sure had to put up with me rambling on about the war over and over, and my novel and horrific scenes, and I thank you so much for that. I should have put up a sign that said, whatever you do, don't mention the war. But seriously, you've been so incredible, so supportive and encouraging, and it means the world to me. And I also really enjoyed when you guys would share your stories, and stories perhaps that also had to do with the war. And some of those stories ended up in the novel. And I guess it's true what they say, be careful what you say to a writer. And as you can tell, people and family are my constant source of inspiration and self-exploration. I grew up with 5 sisters, all of us 1 year apart. Dad was trying for a boy. I was never without a playmate, and my youngest sisters and I were my younger sister and we were really close growing up, and she was really my first real friend. And it was that friendship that I drew from to really write about Michael and Wolfie's close bond. The Yuk twins in the novel are from my childhood, a game that my sister and I would play. We'd pretend we were 2 escaped convicts. I know I didn't play normal games, but Mom and Dad would be the jail keepers, and so we always tried to, hide from them. And when I started writing the novel, I was really quite surprised that they showed up. And in fact, were like, hey, we have to be in this novel too. And so of course I had to put the Yuk twins in the novel. When I wrote about Michael and Wolfie and their adventures, a lot of times I would think back on my childhood with my sisters and our play and our adventures that we would have. And we used to have a house in Holland. And in the novel, I talk about Herr Zimmermann's farm. Well, that farm, Herr Zimmermann's farm, was inspired by the farm that we played on as kids when we would vacation in Holland. And a lot of times we'd be chased by the farmers. And if it wasn't the farmers, it was the cows that chased us. And on the farm, there was quite a large murky pond, and a lot of mud and sediment in it, and we were told as kids not to go swimming in it because a boy had drowned. And so that always sort of stuck with me as a kid, and I guess a way to sort of process that, I placed that story into the novel and the farm. Obviously, I draw from my life and stories that I hear, and I take those stories and I like to fictionalize them. And I do that throughout my writings. And my characters all also imbued a big part of myself, and that really helps me to make the characters come alive. I do have to confess that the characters, for the most part, occupy every thought. They talk nonstop to me in my head, and they are constantly wanting me to tell their stories. So there's a lot of other books that are coming out. but I'd be totally lost in my thoughts was it not for my love, Graham. He's given me what I need most in life, and that's the freedom to have my dreams, no matter how crazy they are. I don't know really how he puts up with it, but personally me, I would never marry an author. They are constantly preoccupied with their characters, and they constantly bring imaginary people home. So, but without Graham in my life, I would most likely never brush my hair. I did that today. I'd be covered in dirt. I did have a shower, and I'd have a zillion coffee cups standing around. And in fact, I do. Behind me, there's probably 5 coffee cups standing there. But it's his unwavering love and caring for me that really I'm able to draw from, and was able to draw from, to create Michael's mom. And she's one of my favorite characters, but I also found her one of the hardest characters to write. A lot of times I get asked why I wrote Secrets in the Shadows. Well, I was born on Remembrance Day in '64 in Germany, and my first 10 years of my life really shaped my world. And I didn't realize just how much my early childhood influenced me until I wrote my biography, and it just sort of all kind of gelled together, my early childhood experiences. As a child, I wasn't read to, and I only had 2 storybooks that I can remember. But what I did have was my mother's war stories, and she always spoke of what happened to her as a child during the war. And her stories really became my playground, and they fueled my imagination. With American Army bases in West Germany, and we lived on a main street, and some of my earliest memories are of tanks rumbling down the street at night. And I wasn't much taller than the windowsill, so I could barely look over it and see these tanks rumbling down the street at night. And across our street there was a war bunker, and our neighbors, we would I remember there was sort of these stairs to go down into the war bunker, but there was a big giant gate, and the neighbors had said not to play there either, because a boy had gotten in and died in that bunker. And as a kid, I always sort of wondered, I didn't really understand the totality of death, and I wondered why weren't the adults rescuing this boy, and I desperately wanted to get him out of there. So those are sort of images that really stayed with me growing up. And then there was a time where my 2 oldest sisters, they found a hideaway under our basement stairs, sort of beside the basement stairs. And they told us younger kids that a Jewish family had hidden there. And again, I thought, why were Jews living under my stairs and not with us in the main part of the house? I thought that World War II was still raging on, but only at night. And my belief of that really sort of was cemented when we would visit our relatives in East Germany. And there was this time that my uncle and my mom were outside of Oma's apartment building in a courtyard, and they were talking and almost whispering, and Uncle Peter looked up and he said, "Oh, we better go inside, people are watching us." And once they were inside, Oma pointed to the light switch, and she had said to Peter, "The Stasis are listening." And that was really confusing to me as a kid, because all of a sudden there were people living in light switches. I just couldn't really understand what they were talking about. And so as a child, my world was really confusing. Adults scared me and they made no sense to me. And World War II was raging on in my backyard at night. To me, war always just happened in the evenings. And as an adult, I'm still really drawn to my mom's war stories, and I've written quite a few of them down and fictionalized some of them. And I just find her life really quite inspiring. And I regularly record my mother when I ask her about her past. Most of Mom's stories are sad and dark and scary, but I just always really loved hearing them. One of my favorite stories about Mom was she was 16 and she was allowed to go on her first holiday to Thuringia with her friends. It was her last year of cooking school, and she had bought her first pair of dress shoes, navy blue wedged heels. And she went out in the courtyard and she was playing around while she was waiting for her friend. And so she held onto a beam and she started to swing. And when she let go to jump off, well, she jumped right into a septic tank. And as she sank into the stinky poo of the tank, she screamed for her brother, and eventually he came and pulled her out of the septic tank. And needless to say, Mom lost her first pair of wedged blue shoes, and now that story has become Wolfie's. I find weaving personal stories into my writings is a way to preserve family history. And it's a way for me to relive moments that I really treasure. Some of my happiest childhood memories are playing with my sisters. Particularly, we would play Robin Hood. And what we would do is we would cut down twigs from the trees branches, and we would go and take Mom's best kitchen knife and sharpen the ends of the sticks, and they became our arrows. And then we would cut our underpants open and pull the elastics out from them and tie them around another stick, and that became our bow. And so what's funny was, you know, here are 6 little girls running around shooting arrows at one another as their underpants are falling off. And Mom, she was always, where is my good kitchen knife? And why do you guys never have elastics in your underpants? Well, that story now is Michael and Wolfie's as well. What I also love doing is listening to people's stories. And I find when you ask questions and you hear about their lives, especially of their childhood, it gives me a better sense of who they are. And I find it just a really nice way of connecting with people. And sometimes their stories too inspire me. Like the time I went to a friend's house for dinner, and after we had finished eating, we were drinking, and I guess my friend felt confident enough to tell me this story. And when he was a young teenager, he was maybe 13 or 14, post-war Germany in Munich, he was in his first year of apprenticeship, and he had befriended an older boy. And what they had decided was to sneak out. And I think the boy was maybe 19. And so my friend, being much smaller, thought, oh, I better put on my dark sunglasses because that would surely make me look older. Well, the reason they were sneaking out at night was to find themselves ladies of the night. Well, I thought that was a great story as well. And so I knew Michael and Wolfie would like to have that be their story. So that's forever out there now. And throughout the novel, I've also sprinkled true accounts of family story in it, like Gunther, Michael's brother, who is based on my father's brother, who his name is Gunther as well. He did have a gravestone fall on his head that resulted in him having to have a metal plate placed into his head, and it also made him stutter. And so I kind of wanted to pay some homage to him. I also have what I like to call little treasures throughout the novel. I tip my hat to people that I admire. And one of those persons was Sophie Scholl. On page 8 in the novel, when Mama is talking about Hitler. She says, "That foolish man will be the death of us all," she sighed as she straightened the single white rose. For those of you that don't know about Sophie Scholl, she was a German student and an anti-Nazi political activist, and she was active with the White Rose nonviolent resistance group in Nazi Germany. She was convicted of high treason after she was found distributing anti-war leaflets at the University of Munich. Sophie was beheaded by guillotine on February 22nd in 1943. Just let that sink in for a little bit. I also tip my hat to Kurt Vonnegut, who is one of my favorite writers, and my favorite book is Slaughterhouse 5. And on page 282, when Michael speaks to Crazy Lily, just before she cuts into Wolfie, Michael says, "Have you done this before?" "9, the crazy lady said. "But I worked in a slaughterhouse in Dresden for 5 years." That was me saying, "Hey, Kurt." There are many more such treasures in the novel, but there is one treasure that would have been disastrous had it not been for the war historian I was working with, Roman Töpel. When he was going over the novel to vet it, I had wrote the address of Michael's house in the novel, and he lived on Schmetterlingstrasse 88. Schmetterling in English is butterfly. And it was Roman that pointed out that the number 88 is code for Heil Hitler amongst the neo-Nazis. What they do is they take the alphabet and take a letter from the alphabet and gave it a number, like A is 1, B is 2, and so that's their code. It's not very clever, but that's what they do. So needless to say, I obviously changed Michael's address, and I was so thankful that Roman had caught that. I also love using symbols throughout the novel, like birds or people's names, and a lot of times when I would come up with the names for characters, after I finished writing their scene, I would look up the meaning of their names, and more often than not, that their meanings of their names was really fitting with the character that I had built. But I won't tell you all about that because you can go back through reading it and discover and try to find out those little treasures in the book yourself. In 1983, my father was murdered. And for years, I created an imaginary perfect father to cope with the loss of him. When I hit my mid-20s, I came to understand that my father wasn't the man that I had created, and in fact was rather complex. But I had the desire to really try to understand him, but there was no way for me to do that because I didn't have his stories. And so I always longed for that, and that's partly why I wrote this novel. All I had were a few childhood memories of him. And when I was 15, I was on holidays with my dad, and it was pretty much the last time that I saw him. I discovered that my dad, he couldn't read or write. He was writing a postcard home, and he just signed his name, and his name was just a scribble. And I said to him, "Dad, why aren't you writing on it?" And he just sort of shrugged and felt quite embarrassed about it. And then that's when I realized Dad didn't know how to read or write, and that's partly why I was never read to by my dad. Dad, he had a violent temper, and at times I was really quite terrified of my father. But when I would watch war films with him, I, for some reason, always felt really safe. Dad also had a really large scar on his leg. And when I would ask him about it, or my sisters would ask him, he would say he was bitten by a giant water snake when he had fought in the Korean War. Not until after I wrote my book, I learned that the scar on his leg happened when he had volunteered at 17 in the Korean War, and in fact was in a tank battalion and was blown up. The tank was blown up, and he had shrapnel hit him. So, this novel was really a way for me to explore who my father was and what perhaps were his stories. Michael and his father, Rudy, are aspects of my father. The good parts of my dad I put into Michael, and the cruel parts of my father I put into Rudy. I was also able to understand, like, by doing that process, I was able to understand my father better, and what I didn't expect by unearthing parts of him, I found that I had been carrying around wounds that were my parents' wounds, generational trauma, guilt, and shame for being German. By writing this novel, I gained a deeper sense of compassion for my father and mother, and I started to record my mom's war stories with a deeper understanding and with way more compassion for her. I believe for the first time I gave my parents a voice. I don't believe they ever understood the trauma or the shame or the guilt that they carried throughout their lives. Or that they even had post-traumatic stress on the things that they really witnessed as children. I say this because of a conversation I had with my mom. During one of my recordings of her, she had said, "What could I have done?" And it was in that moment I understood more than ever that Mom was feeling guilt for World War II war atrocities. I don't think she had ever heard someone say to her, Mom, you were a child and you had nothing to do with the atrocities of World War II. You have no need to feel guilt or shame. She was 5 years old and in fact was a victim and a survivor of World War II. My mom, she witnessed brutalities that no child should really know. But that day of us talking, she heard those words for the first time. For me, I went on a quest to discover who my father was. And what I found was the heart of my mother. I discovered a part of me that needed healing. And I realized there are no easy answers in life. Life is really quite complex. And all I can do is help push the pendulum towards a kinder world. And with that, I'll read a short excerpt from the novel. The part that I'm going to read is the first few pages, and I'll let you try to decipher the deeper meaning of the first sentence. Chapter 1, Old Man's Wisdom, November 1934. I gazed into the butcher's window, and there, sandwiched between a goose and a sheep's head, my mirrored image stared back at me. I'm perfect, I told my reflection. I thrust my arm forward and clicked my heels. Heil Hitler. Frau Silberstein stepped out of the butcher's doorway. Michael, why are you saluting dead animals? Put your arm down before someone sees you. Feeling my face turning red, I stared at the cobblestone street, and like a balloon that had lost its air, I let my arm drift to my chest. Tell your mama that I will see her tomorrow for coffee, said as she rode off on her bicycle. Michael! Michael! I lifted my head, shielding my eyes from the sun, and turned to see who was calling me. From the doorway of the bakery across the street, Frau Bummel was waving to me. I have the flour milk for your mama, she called. As I stepped off the high curb, I stumbled on a loose cobblestone and jetted onto a road, just as a hay cart pulled by an ox rumbled past. Watch where you're going, little boy, the driver shouted. Frau Bummel held the bakery door open, and the tantalizing smell from buttery cakes, sugar-laden pastries, and freshly baked bread made me forget about how humiliated I had felt just moments ago. Guten Tag, Frau Bummel. Her tall, slim build cast a looming shadow over me, and as I stared up at her, I marveled at the neatly braided buns on either side of her head. Hello, Michael. How was school today? Gut, danke. She reached into her display case and handed me a raspberry-filled donut. Here, eat, eat. I'll be back in a moment. She stepped behind a curtain into the back room. I bit into the jelly donut. We had special doctors come to our school today. Some of the raspberry filling dripped onto my shirt. Yeah, yeah. I rubbed at the red stain, but I only created a bigger mess. And the doctor who examined me said, "You, Michael boy, are a perfect Aryan." That's nice. She reemerged from the back room and plunked a 10-kilogram sack down on the counter. A plume of flour settled over everything. She peered across the display case, and her mouth twisted. Oh, I think you're too small to carry this home. I can manage, I said as I brushed the flour out of my hair. I'm almost 7.5. I reached for the bag and tugged on it, but it wouldn't budge. It's much too big for you, Michael. Tell your mama that her Bummel will bring it by later today. I punched the sack. All right, but one day I'll be strong enough to carry big things. You will. Run along now. Auf Wiedersehen, Frau Bummel. Danke for the donut. The bell above the door clanged, announcing my departure. I caught sight of Frau Silberstein outside the florist, 2 stores up the street from the butcher's shop, placing a bunch of yellow carnations in her bicycle basket. She got on her bike, wobbling as she maneuvered her way through a gauntlet of older Hitler-Jugend kids who were dressed in their crisp uniforms, brown shirts and black shorts. Jude, they yelled after her. Jude! For a minute, I watched her bumping along the cobblestone street, but she never said a word to those boys as they laughed and joked amongst themselves. My older brothers, the twins Kurt and Peter, but not Gunther, were already in the Hitler-Jugend, and my 2 sisters, Susie and Paula, were at the BDM, the League of German Girls. As I ran home, taking the shortcut through Herr Zimmermann's farm, I began to imagine how in a few years I too would receive a letter from Adolf Hitler himself, summoning me to join the Deutsche Jungvolk. Papa would be proud of me then. The crisp air filled my nostrils as I ran through the grasses of Herr Zimmermann's sheep pasture. Ahead of me was a wooden fence that separated the sheep from the potato field. I took a deep breath and began sprinting towards it, yelling, "I'm special!" And like a firecracker propelled by gunpowder, I shot into the air and almost, but not quite, sailed over the fence. My trailing leg caught on the top rail, and I found myself dangling from the fence, my head on the ground. I hung upside down like that for a minute or two, and that's when I realized how beautiful Herr Zimmermann's farm was. Then I flipped my legs forward and landed with a thud on my back. I jumped up, pulled my jacket straight, and took a deep breath. Next time. I told myself as I did a quick surveillance. Good. No one had seen me. And with that, I'll end it. And